Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute's continued programming today. Some people will be joining us live online for the first time, but welcome to our Enterprise Club members. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to see you. You guys always rev me back up and get excited about life and the work that we do here at AEI. I'm Mackenzie Eaglin. I'm a fellow thinking about military stuff all the time, all day. What do you want the military to do? Are you buying what you say you want it to do? Is it enough? Is it not enough? Does it meet the strategy? That's kind of what my bread and butter. And I'm really excited that today we have Senator Eric Schmitt here to join us for the next 50 minutes or so. Senator from Missouri, a good friend of a friend of mine. He's a sixth-generation Missourian. He's a husband and a father, a lawyer, a teacher, former state attorney general and treasurer, former state senator, and now U.S. senator. And his committees are Commerce, Armed Services, and the Joint Economic Committee. That's all the bio reading I'm going to do today, but I'll let you talk more.
Thank you for them. That's great. The shorter one's better.
I feel like they're here because they already know who you are and they want to hear from you. So we will get to it. It's been a slow week. Nothing going on, right?
Nothing at all. We were gone for 6 weeks, and now it's 1,000 miles an hour, pretty fast.
Right.
Yes.
Getting a taste for the sprint that is 4 years, I think, ahead.
Yeah.
So great. Okay. Well, I have to. We were chatting in the green room. Senator Schmitt has graciously agreed to just reflect on any current events, particularly cabinet officials that we know so far, national security picks. Any thoughts? Any reflections?
I'm excited. I think President Trump is, spending a lot of time with him, especially at the end of the campaign, and then as they've moved into the transition, they had a full head of steam, which is good. So a lot of this process had begun, ahead of time to be ready for this, because I think that lesson learned from 2016, it wasn't, it took a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. And so I think they wanted to get ahead of that, and that I'm really happy with the picks. And Susie Wiles, I just got to know her. Having her as the chief of staff, I don't think people truly appreciate what a great influence she is, mm-hmm. and she's really bright. She's very quiet behind the scenes, but I think she's going to help really lead that White House along with the other folks that they're bringing on in a positive direction. And President Trump's ready to roll. I mean, he is. It's a pretty unique opportunity. I mean, regardless of your party affiliation or anything, it is the greatest American political comeback, certainly in our lifetime, but probably in American history. Mm-hmm. To come back and all the things that were thrown at him, and to end up now with a second term. And I think he views that as, a great opportunity. And we are at a crossroads. There's a lot of things happening. We're going to talk about some of those, yeah. On the foreign policy and on the military side, but certainly domestically too. A lot of the talk on the campaign trail was about that. So I think they understand the moment, and it's going to be a really eventful 4 years.
You are in a prime position. You'll be confirming a lot of these people, and of course overseeing the massive Defense Department, one of the largest employers on planet Earth, with obviously a unique mission, right? Only the feds can use violence in the name of the state, which is why we care so much about the Defense Department, the health of the U.S. military. Are you able to walk me through an America First national security policy? I mean, I have my own thoughts on how that might actually translate, and how some of these people like Congressman Waltz and others think about it. But do you, or what are your priorities underneath that? If you were going to talk to Susie or whomever or Mike and say, all right, so how do we translate this? How do we operationalize America First for national security? What would you focus on?
Well, I think it starts with the understanding that we have to be much more realistic about what our core national interests are. Mm-hmm. I think that there has been a lot of, quite frankly, a lot of hubris in this town about thinking that we can do everything with essentially an eroded military-industrial base, and that's just not the reality. And so I think that understanding what our real threats are, and we're going to talk a lot about what the threat that China poses, and understanding where our resources are and where we allocate them, and the things that we need to do better is a sort of a core mission of that. And I think that, to the extent that there's discussion, I mean, we talk about a pivot to China. I think we have to really actually do that. We can't just talk about that. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're going to hear, a lot of discussion amongst our European allies are always wondering what that means. And the truth is, that they need to step up. That's just the truth. And if you, from China's perspective, they view the last 200 years as sort of a historical aberration. They truly view themselves as the Middle Kingdom. They are hell-bent on domination. They view that they think the American experiment is doomed to fail. By the way, a lot of people have been betting against the American experiment since its inception, right? This idea of self-governance, it's complicated, it's messy. It's just not the way of the world. It hasn't been historically. It isn't even the way of the world in most places right now. But our founders were genius in that they spread out this power with checks and balances and federalism horizontally and vertically, all meant to protect individual liberty. That is still a pretty unique thing in the world. I mean, other folks try to emulate it. We want more people. We think that every individual has a right to be free. But as far as I think the America First policy, it's understanding our first role is to protect the American people. And where are our greatest threats? It doesn't mean we're withdrawing from the world. That's not what that means. It just, I think it's whether you want to call it a realist or a prioritizer. I just think that those terms, as intellectually get thrown about. We have to have I think a foreign policy and a sort of a attention to detail on our defense spending that is commiserate with that belief. And I do think that for me is what that means. And so it doesn't mean NATO's going away. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that, and we'll get more into it, but that Europe, I think, needs to step up in a more meaningful way.
Thank you for throwing me that softball to throw you back a question, which is what we spend on defense and what we ask of our allies in burden sharing. Because I agree with you, more can be done. Not only more spending, but more spending on combat power. Yeah. Something we need to do as well. But I wonder how much awareness you have among your colleagues. So in our defense world, members on defense committees, we speak the same language. You care about these topics, but thinking of your colleagues perhaps not on armed services or on defense-related or national security committees. We're barely at 3% of GDP, and President Trump on the campaign trail talked a lot about 3% of GDP for NATO. Is this a 3% for thee but not for me? Or are we going to also need to increase our defense budget based on the things we're going to talk about?
Yeah, no, I've supported that. I do think that is where we need to go. But I do think that when you peel back the onion a little bit on that, it can't just be about the money, right? It's always about the money. But, and we do need to spend more, but we also need to spend it in an effective way. I mean, you sort of compare that to what China does. So we spend about $840 billion-ish a year on defense spending. A lot of that's personnel, which is a different sort of dynamic than what the Chinese, the PRC does. And all of theirs is focused on the Indo-Pacific. Do you think about that? If they're based on the numbers, right? Let's say they're at 700 or 750, depending, you get labor costs, all these sorts of things. So if they're effectively on par, close to it, and all of it is in the Indo-Pacific. And in the last 2 years, we've spent about $240 billion in the European theater. Right. We're not keeping up, right? And so, do we have the best military in the world? Yes. China has a bigger Navy than we have now. It's not a better Navy, but it's a bigger Navy. It is bigger. And their shipbuilding capacity is, by multiple degrees greater than ours. And so I think it has to do with their outputs. It's not just the dollars, it's the outputs. So yes, circling back to Europe, I do think that we need to increase our spending, but they need to increase their spending. And if we think our military industrial base has eroded, it's absolutely happened in Europe. And so I'm not sure, I think there's a bit of a reckoning coming. I think they're starting to get the message, at least that's my hope. Yeah. But they are very important allies, but I think they have to understand that as far as the United States is concerned, and whether they know it or not, China is also a big concern for them. Clearly, Russia's at their doorstep. I get that, but having a dominant power that is again hell-bent on domination in Asia is a recipe for a lot of problems for European countries as well.
So. Too often in Washington until recently, you hear the tired trope, well, America spends more on the military than the next X countries combined. It used to be 15, then it was 12, then it was 8. Now, based on my research, it's 0. We don't spend more than anybody. And in fact, we spend less because we're spread across 3 theaters, as you just outlined quite well. And so Beijing gets outsized, bang for its buck on every dollar it spends, since it's concentrated in the Western Pacific. And so why did we do this research here at AEI? To show China's true military spending, which I know is, you've been a champion to sort of open, be more transparent, shed some light on it, raise awareness. Because 1 or 2 years ago, a US senator, not you, came to the Senate floor, said, America's spy community, our intelligence agencies think Beijing's real military spending is about $700 billion per year. And I said, well, now we need to go figure out how they got to that figure at AEI through public and open source data. And we were extremely conservative. I actually don't think it's 711, although that's the number we roughly came out with. But it gets tricky. People take issue with conversions and purchasing power parity. But even when you put that aside, you just count the uncounted, clear military, things that are meant to use violence or achieve military goals. So you can see here things like space and military research and development. These things are obviously military spending. So really, if you just even take out the controversial part of our analysis, so-called controversial, and you just do this, and you look at the outputs, which is, it's not just the largest Navy. Largest Army in the world, largest Air Force, sub-strategic missile force, largest Coast Guard. I mean, you can see the trend lines here.
Yeah.
They have mass in an overwhelming capacity, and at some point, our stuff is better is going to lose to mass. What are you thinking about all of this?
Yeah, I think that's particularly true with the Navy. I really do. I mean, we're reaching a point now where even though we have a better Navy, the sheer numbers really work against us. I will say that there's a couple of positives to take from this, but we have to double down on them. In my view, our biggest strengths, our biggest advantages are underneath the sea with our nuclear submarines, and then we've always had air superiority. Now, we are trying to plus up those numbers for more nuclear subs. I think there's some important, but it takes too long. We do not have the capacity. So like, even if we want to do all these things, even if we're spending all this money, we are not producing what we need. And then also I would say, and soon to be Chairman Wicker and I co-authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago about the NGAD program, the Next Generation Fighters. Why are these important? They see further down the road. They're very important. They're also going to look a lot different. You're going to have more sort of autonomous aircraft around. This is the future. But the Secretary of the Air Force doesn't want to do that anymore. Zeroed it out. And so if we want to double down on our advantages, which is what we should be doing, it should be the next generation fighters, which we've had the advantage. It should be the nuclear submarines, because if you kind of play this out, and we're in a real struggle with the Navy, right? And we need to do more with the Navy. But you look at what Ukraine has been able to do, sort of wipe out the Russian Navy without having a Navy. Look, one of the bets that China has laid down over the last decade or two is asymmetric weaponry, right? Like hypersonics. I mean, they're very interested in this because the very expensive advantages you might have get neutralized with lower cost weapon systems. And I think we need to do a much better job of thinking that way. And if you read The Boiling Moat, which I don't know if, but there's a lot of people have ideas about what Taiwan can do to sort of protect itself, but a lot of it's going to be this, right? If you're going to have overwhelming force, at some point it's overwhelming, but there's a lot you can do without spending that amount of money to protect yourself. And I think the United States, there are some things that we need to do to catch up. We can't. And look, Boeing is in St. Louis, is in my backyard. There's a very important role for the primes to have on expensive weapon systems and platforms. However, we do, and I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit here, but we do need to have a more innovative procurement process where if we got a problem that industry thinks they can go solve, that they're not caught up with the bureaucrats in the Pentagon for a decade. China does not have this problem. No. And so the irony of that, of course, is our real big advantage is innovation. It always has been. China's good at copying. Well, if we cut out the innovation by having central planning of our own, we don't really have that advantage anymore. So my hope is that the Pentagon leadership moving forward, hopefully in the next 4 years, instead of us just talking about this procurement problem we have, that we actually reform it. Because at some point it is going to catch up to us.
One of the problems, well, I see contracting slowness as a huge problem. I see, but another one, as you pointed out with the NGAD and great op-ed, which is, and the Air Force is particularly egregious about this. Well, there's going to be new technology, and so we should just abandon the idea we have on the drawing board now. And if you keep saying that over and over, you just get paralysis. You never get fielded combat power. Right. So do you see that? Do you agree that that's a challenge?
Yes, and for sure, the F-15EX is a good example, right? Like, we're still using those. They're still very effective, particularly in the Middle East.
Yep.
And the idea of transitioning to the newest and greatest toy, which I use that,
I understand.
You know what I mean by a toy. But without having the capability that you currently have in maintaining that is a real problem. And so what is that bridge? But I do think you're right. Abandoning things that have worked for the new shiny object can get you in a real, problem. And I think that is a delicate balance. But I do feel like we're erring on the side now of sacrificing too many things. And the NGAD's a great example. If you don't start that now, China is not letting up. They're not letting up. They know what our advantages are. They want to close that gap. And if we're not continuing again to press those advantages, we're going to end up in a situation where we wake up one day and China isn't just some near peer. They've surpassed us, and it's simply it's not acceptable.
I have visited Boeing's facilities in St. Louis, and they also build very unique and necessary munitions and missiles and warheads. And what was fascinating was just the extent of the backlog. Well, you already referenced submarines. I mean, the backlogs are real everywhere across the board. Everybody wants our equipment because it's high quality. It's going to work. It's very effective at creating whatever military effects you want it to. So our allies are all in line. The services are in line. America's military is in line. But I agree with you, the pie, so I want to think, though, just rebuilding the defense industrial base and expanding it seems to be the obvious requirement at this point. If you believe, production is deterrence, I think Bill LaPlante says, I personally agree with that. But that means we need to buy and build at scale.
For sure.
And munitions are...
And the B-21 is a great example. So the B-21, Whiteman Air Force right now is the only spot for the B-2, which is a very important part of our nuclear triad. It's Whiteman's in Missouri. But the B-21 is sort of the next generation part of the nuclear triad. There's going to be 3 places for it. Whiteman will be one of them. But we ought to open up a second production line of B-21s in Oklahoma. No one's really talking about that in any real way. And so... Why
Oklahoma?
Well, that's the place that you could actually start to go, like identify. And also with shipbuilding, right? We ought to have additional shipbuilding, but we get caught up in this, anyway. But it really will, honestly, it's going to take leadership from the top instead of us, talking about and diagnosing the problem which are real, who actually want to see something change. And the procurement thing it's right up there at the top of the list. So not only is it slow, not only do we not have enough contractors or capacity, we're also, which is not an easy problem to solve, we're incredibly reliant on China for a lot of the materials that you need to do all the stuff we're talking about. I think COVID sort of woke everybody up. I know for me, my son is 20 and nonverbal, has epilepsy, and starting to think through the fact that if China really wanted to, most of those drugs are produced or with materials from China, like most pharmaceuticals, that if China really wanted to turn the spigot off, they could, and we're not just talking about PPE. Like they could, and we cannot, from a national security perspective, be that reliant on China for a lot of things. I think I don't know if it was the head of Lockheed or if it was had an op-ed, I think, talking about this very fact that they can't do everything they want to do and produce, without Chinese raw materials. That is a scary thing. And so, as we look at sort of permitting reform here in the United States. Like we're mining cobalt in Missouri now. Like there's a lot of places where we can get materials in the United States, but if the EPA isn't allowing you to do it, and it's the cleanest place to do any of this stuff in the world, we're not going to actually be able to do the things. It's not just having the factory. This is not like World War II, where you turn the Ford auto plant into building bombers. We can't do that right now. You can't just flip the switch. And so I do think you sort of see this trouble on the horizon, and it's now, I think, time to bring a lot of those. It's not just the jobs, the manufacturing, but also the mining and refining of the critical materials.
Well said. I totally agree with all of that, plus your assessment of the industrial base, plus antibiotics. My children never can seem to get theirs. It's out everywhere all the time. And this is a problem identified at the start of the administration, and yet it seems...
We're in the same place.
It's just shocking. So you recently took a trip to a congressional delegation to the Asia Pacific. Can you give us a sense of what you heard and saw?
Bill Hagerty organized it, the former ambassador, senator from Tennessee, former ambassador to Japan. And my only advice is if you're ever going to Japan, go with Bill Hagerty. It's great. They rolled out the red carpet. We had 7 senators there, so it was a really strong delegation. It was part of, the mission of it was to make sure we were strengthening economic ties principally, but also these, military ties between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Clearly, I believe, China, or Japan, I should say, understands in a more meaningful way now the regional threat that China poses to them. South Korea also, but they're, clearly North Korea is always their principal concern. But I think also what's happened by China kind of showing their fangs in the last few years, which is why, by the way, reports like this are very important. Good. And why on the Joint Economic Committee, we're pressing now for a more thorough review, like we did in the 1980s of the Soviet Union, to expose the flaws in the Chinese economy. Because what they do to their regional, neighbors is they talk about America as a declining power. You can't rely on them for this or that, right? All of that sort of propaganda that they push. We need to play that same game and talk about how, they have some real issues. We're talking about obviously some of the money that they're spending on their, but they have a lot of corruption issues. Yep. Xi Jinping, had a round of firings. They have their own issues, and I think that we ought to be unapologetic about making sure people are aware of why this centralized communist dictatorial regime that has concentration camps is a threat to you. And I don't think we should, step around that. I think we should talk about it directly. But exposing some of the things in the Joint Economic Committee would be important. But the point is, Japan, South Korea, countries like the Philippines now, I think recognize in a much more unified way the threat that China poses and how important it is for them to work with one another and strengthen those ties, and with the United States. I think they, South Korea in particular, they view the United States as liberators still to this day. Wow. There are still tensions between, to some degree, South Korea and Japan based on their history, and that runs pretty deep. So I think the United States playing a role in helping them see eye to eye on some issues is really important role for us. China would like nothing more than for those two countries to continue to, maybe not see the world the same way. I think that what's happening in the South China Sea with the harassment of these, Filipino shipping vessels is a real thing. Yes. That people talk about Taiwan a lot. We have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, and the Coast Guard, the Chinese Coast Guard.
Not counted in their military budget, but they're the ones ramming the vessel, making it inoperable, which is an act of war.
And it's a tinderbox to some degree. Yes. And the Philippines understand that. I think it's a great development that they're opening up, some of their facilities for the United States. I think they view us in a really positive light. So there's a lot of great things that are happening because China has, I'm sure AEI, you've written about this extensively. Xi Jinping, the whole sort of laid-back approach, he is not doing that. He's in an unprecedented third term. He wants an unprecedented fourth term. But the world is sort of watching that. They don't want people to perceive them that way. It's why, actually, when I was attorney general in Missouri, we sued a lot of folks over a lot of things, but we sued the People's Republic of China for unleashing the COVID on the world. Why is that important, and why am I banned from ever going to China because of it? Well, they were bad actors in that. They didn't tell the world in time. and they cut off they kept their international flights going, but they cut off flights from Wuhan internally to the country. They went from a net exporter of PPE to a net importer of PPE before they told the world about COVID. Why do they care about that? Because they want to be viewed as this sort of benevolent, economic, Belt and Road, we can connect you sort of country. That's not who they are. So I think any time that we can sort of expose who they really are is really important. But I think that the good news is, on that trip, sort of solidified my belief that our allies in the Indo-Pacific understand that too, and we need to do everything we can to strengthen those relationships.
We're going to turn to you all and our online viewers here in just a moment. But when we had Senator Hagerty's successor, Ambassador Emanuel, here at AEI recently, I joked with him. I said, "You and me and two other people are the only four nerds in Washington who talk about this term called allied co-production." He's obviously he's the ambassador of co-production. So basically, where there are various forms of this. There's allied research and development. There's allied production, allied sustainment. But basically, where we build things in concert with our friends and allies. I see co-production of military capabilities as not just good for our industrial base, accessing know-how and talent that we don't have, but really if there is a China challenge that's not, that's kinetic or violence, I don't know that we'll have time to flow in forces for many months, the way we have in previous wars. And so if it's kind of not already forward, infrastructure, technology, workforces, for rapid repair and resupply, for contested logistics.
Yeah.
I think co-production is important for many of these reasons. There's a business case and a policy case for co-production. Did it come up? Is this something?
Yeah, no, actually, Ambassador Emanuel, we talked about that when we were there.
Good.
That issue came up. I think South Korea in particular is talking about, they're sort of opened up for some maintenance operations now.
Yes.
The country that really gets this, of course, is Australia,
yes.
which is, we don't talk about as much, but with AUKUS and the nuclear subs is really an important aspect of what they do. I also think, flipping it back on the military side too, I think the Army and the Marines and the Army it's sort of back to the future a little bit. They when you go back to the 1940s and the role that they played, they understand, and I do believe this, they understand the logistics role and the logistic challenge that they would have if we actually are in a scrap in the Indo-Pacific. And so, but doing that is not easy, right? I think that we've got a map in our office, our national security team. I was telling them I want all these maps, and they're like, "Is this the map?" I'm like, "No, it's not the map." We kept getting all these maps just to show the vast expanse of the Pacific. I think it's tempting, by the way, for senators and others. They get on a flight to Europe. You're very important when you go over there. They want to talk. It's an easy flight, relatively. It is not easy to get to Japan, and we've taken a particular interest in the Philippines, but it's a long way to get there, and that's just sort of you're on a 737 or whatever. To move the amount of things that you need to move for what we would potentially need to do is a feat, and so I do think having allies that we can rely on for whether it's co-production. I think we got to. The nuclear subs are a great example. Doing something in Australia versus going back to Los Angeles, that's a big deal.
Yep.
That's a big deal.
You're a man after my own heart talking about maps. Just so you know. My oldest child, he's a nerd for foreign policy, not because of mom. And I always say, we got to start with the map. Where's your map? Whenever we talk about any problem.
So I won't ask you how old you are. I'm Gen X. I'm solidly Gen X. I was in the back with the Rand McNally maps. The anytime we'd go, like St. Louis to Destin was like the quickest way you could get to the beach, and I'm like pouring over these maps. So I think it gives context. I got people back in Missouri when I get picked up from the airport, something like that. A lot of the younger folks. I mean, it's all Google Maps or Apple, and I'm like, you turn left here. How do you not know that this is where you're supposed to turn left? But we're very reliant on GPS, which, by the way, I was looking at the space programs up here, and we want to get to questions. I apologize, but us being dominant in space and in sort of commercial space launches is really, really important for our national security. So whether it's Blue Origin, SpaceX, I'm actually the ranking member, I guess, hopefully. Chair of the subcommittee of Space and Science on the Commerce Committee, and we're trying to cut through the regulatory tape to make sure we get more launches. There's no reason the FAA has a role, but we got to, what SpaceX has been able to do, we now have dominance with commercial space and getting satellites out. The whole constellation of the satellites, Starlink, I mean, this is a huge innovation, because one of the questions I'll ask in open hearings and closed hearings is, I'm from St. Louis. If there's a prediction of snow tomorrow, there's like a bread line, like people for milk at the grocery store. If we were dealing with something for 5 days or 10 days, phones, communicate, things that we rely on, I mean, you know, these are real challenges that as a citizenry we would deal with. And we absolutely have to be resilient by way of our communication networks. And so the things that we're doing with satellites are really important. And that is a big advantage for us. So I talked about advantages and things that we're close. We have to maintain that advantage.
I hope you've read AEI's, my colleague Todd Harrison, his report on the third space age. I hope, if not, we'll happily share it with you. But back to the maps, if you were to take your globe and reorient it, just not as the world is, and you put a pin in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there you see no land.
Right.
That's how much water and distance we're talking about. It's really remarkable. Okay, so I'm looking at you, our friends here in the room, and then I'll start to stare at my iPad. But who has questions for Senator Schmidt? Okay. Please let us know name, affiliation, or favorite, I don't know, NFL team. Go ahead.
Hi.
Obviously the Chiefs. Is that what someone says?
Hi, Evan from New York. Unfortunately, a New York Giants fan.
My husband.
Can you just help us a little? I think we can all envision we can talk about what would happen, but what a China-Taiwan quote-unquote conflict could look like, big versus small, and just all the issues that come along with that. What else, for the people who are not as studied on this subject, what does a China aggression in a larger scale look like to the people in the know here? Because I can envision cyber. That seems very logical to me and us, dismantling infrastructure within the United States or Europe or allies, from inside. That seems very debilitating and very effective without actually going anywhere. I don't know that I can envision picking up 1 billion Chinese people and moving them somewhere, because that just doesn't seem logistically feasible nor successful. And I think all this stuff we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine sort of suggests that cheap drones are a way to undermine moving people around in a very effective way. So maybe just help us. You mentioned the Navy. Like, what does the manifestation of China aggression look like to people in the know?
Well, I'll just take a crack at it, and I'd love to hear what you have to say too. So I think that part of the concern, why I think there's such a fixation with China, is that their ability to sort of break out of the first island chain, and you start dealing with like second island chain issues, all of a sudden, we don't have many places actually to be, which is why those alliances are really important. We've got obviously a huge presence in Japan, South Korea, Australia is an important ally, but if China it really was hell-bent, as I've described, it won't happen all at once, but this sort of incremental increase in staging, and of course the technology in Taiwan, I mean, with semiconductors, I mean, we have to get away. Like, the CHIPS Act was great, but we're not able to build a chips factory in Arizona because they haven't hired enough ex-convicts yet, okay? The DEI requirements are preventing a chips factory from being built because they haven't checked that box yet. It's insane. Wow. Like, no one does this in the world except us. So, so you've got that sort of element to it too. But I think that, I'm glad you brought up cyber, because I didn't mention it, but it is a real threat. They've been very aggressive. We've actually sort of called them out, had briefings on it. I think that this is my opinion, and I've stated in letters to various departments, including DoD, that I think that we ought to let them know what our capabilities are too. They know it, but I don't have a problem. I mean, if we were going to talk about mutually assured destruction, we ought to make sure they're aware of what our capabilities are too. So anyway, but that is definitely a tool. I think for me, the scariest thing is probably how quickly you could move up the escalation ladder, right? Guam is a U.S. territory. We have a lot of assets in Guam.
And a lot of citizens.
And if something were to happen in Guam, because that's where our nerve center is, effectively, what does that do, right? And so, those are things that sort of keep you up at night a little bit, because, I mean, China has sort of, Xi Jinping has sort of said 2027, we could be ready to roll. And all the things that we talked about here today we have to fix quickly. And some of them aren't easily fixed quickly, but you're never going to fix them if you don't actually start to turn this thing around. And spending more money is a part of it, but fixing this industrial base to make sure we have what we need. And by the way, for a fight like long-range fires that we need in the Pacific, may not necessarily be for a land war in Europe. So we are making decisions about what we produce with limited capacity. And I don't want to get into like a whole thing on Ukraine, but we are picking things. This idea that we're doing everything is false, and we certainly can't do them all well.
I worry about the insidious renorming that CCP always has underway. So what was unacceptable yesterday or impolite at the party, the next day is totally acceptable. And slowly over time, they do this enough, like when Pelosi visited Taiwan and the kinds of bomber flights and everything, and just the list is long. And slowly over time, you exhaust and fatigue world leaders from reacting, the militaries from, rapid launch and air superiority flights, and then they just get what they want anyway. We had a colleague, Zach Cooper, he just returned from a trip to the region. He was briefing our AEI team and telling us about different things. We were talking about, of course, the Philippines. What I mentioned about the China Coast Guard, it was that August or September, ramming this Filipino vessel and rendering it inoperable. That's using violence to achieve some sort of political aim, which is an act of war. And so that's a problem. And there's no consequence as of yet, as far as I know, for that. But then what's happened since then at Sabina Shoal, not Second Thomas Shoal, which was the other place we were all worried about earlier in the year, but Kinmen and other places, I agree, we're worried about everything. But there's basically a mini quarantine and a blockade now underway where the CCP, through different arms services, is saying, we are going to board your ships because, safety for our people, we need to inspect your cargo. Also, blockades and quarantines are acts of war. We're not responding, or not responding forcefully enough, or agreeing to it. It's like when they established the Air Defense Identification Zone and we filed manifests for our flights. If we go along with it, then it becomes the new norm, and they get what they want. So they're just terrifying. And I'm worried about Washington's slowness of decision-making, maniacal fear of escalation. I see that I think everyone knows that outside of Washington. But okay, enough for me. Go ahead. Your question. Yes.
Thank you very much. Chris Cudmore, based in London. Europe doesn't have an army, has to get its act together, but there's a long way to go, as you say, in terms of industrial base to support an army, the sovereignty, the rule changes, the governmental changes, the coming together. So it's going to take a while. If we're going to have peace through strength, we're going to need to continue to have American security guarantees for a period of time. How does that sort of weave together with some of the prioritizations that you're talking about with American First?
I think that the most important aspect of that is I think that and I do think there's Germany maybe has been the worst culprit of this. I mean, their industrial base rates, this is totally degraded. And there's obviously a historical element to how they view militarization and even expenditures on that front. But if you think about the genesis of NATO was, we did not want the Soviet Union to overrun Europe. Europe was economically, obviously depressed, and really was in need of a great deal of protection. So this discussion is not, and to get them back on their feet, right? So I think that we just have to have a family conversation of, things are a little bit different now. Right, like the United States' greatest threat is in the Pacific, and you're very important allies. We have this treaty, but you have to step up. You have to spend more money on these things. You have to produce more things. You have to be willing, because I think to a lot of people, I'll just tell you, I don't want to presume this about anybody, but the people that I talk to in a state like Missouri, they don't particularly understand the amount of money that we spend, or what do we get out of it. And I think that, but more than anything, we have subsidized to a large degree the social welfare programs of Europe now for decades. And people don't appreciate that when it's, so the point is, all of this, I think, is going to probably come to a head. The Munich Security Conference will be very interesting, I'm guessing, in a few months.
Good to flag.
And I think we're going to go. Because I just think that, because look, I was in Europe for a conference about a year and a half ago, and all this sort of like, oh my God, Donald Trump, oh my God, like, and really to me, what he brought to the forefront and in those conversations was, hey, you need to kick in here, right? You need to kick in, because if it's $100 million to build an F-35, and we spent about $240 billion in the last 2 years in Europe, the American people wonder, when we have a $35 trillion debt, what are we doing, right? And so, again, it isn't to say we're abandoning those relationships, not at all, but I do think there needs to be a greater sense of urgency, a long way of answering your question, a greater sense of urgency. And I think that we can help spur that conversation and understand that we are partners and we are allies, but the American people feel like they've not, they're kind of getting the raw end of the deal right now. That's just the truth.
We have time for one more quick question from you. Yes.
So just to kind of piggyback off of that, what's the stick that's going to get Europe to do that?
Say it again one more time for our online audience.
Just to piggyback off of the other question, the prior question, what's going to be the stick that's going to encourage Europe to move and to move quickly?
Well, for one thing, I don't know where things are at, in Ukraine in say May. But one thing I know for certain is nobody in Missouri has ever said to me, Eric, the most important thing you can do in Washington is send another $160 billion to Ukraine. So to me, our European allies need to step up in a much more meaningful way if that war is going to continue. Now, I believe President Trump, I think there's going to be a psychological impact of this election that will be very positive for our relationships around the world. I mean, I think that people understand, and there was a reason why I don't think we had any wars break out in the 4 years he was president before. So I do think that leadership of saying, now is your time to step up. We have other priorities also for the United States. And somebody like Macron saying that, we're not going to get dragged into a war with China, that's not very productive. Mm-hmm. That's not very productive. So I know he was one of the first people to congratulate President Trump, and I can understand why. I think we need to have an expectation of our friends and allies that look, we are really pivoting to China. These alliances are important, but you need to step up, and we just can't pay, the amount of money that we're spending there without you guys kicking in. It's not going to happen anymore. And quite frankly, I don't even think, because I think we should be spending more on our military, I don't think 3% is adequate for NATO countries. I don't. And by the way, I was in a country in Europe on that same trip I mentioned, who said they were pulling back. They were at 2%. They wanted to get to 3%, but it's like, look, we've had a lot of floods. We're going backwards. And you know what? I don't like, but what it speaks to is that the first order of elected representatives in any country, in my view, is to be responsive to the needs of their people. And I think that, circling all the way back down to this America First agenda, that's what's driving this. And I think that's, there needs to be a greater level of fairness and a reprioritization of what we think are our greatest threats. And that's why I'd probably put myself in the category of the realists or prioritizers, which is a growing number in the United States Senate and a growing number in Congress.
Mm-hmm. Senator Schmidt, thank you for coming to AEI today. You've had a kind of a busy day, to say the least, and you made time for us and our Enterprise Club members. Thank you for your thoughtfulness and your leadership on